Welcome everybody to webinar number 4 for our Oklahoma Airport System Plan update. Today we're going to be talking about facility and service objectives. As you probably have seen in some of the draft information, we've got 4 categories that we are breaking our airports into: national business, regional business, general community. We'll hear more about that from our consultant that will be giving our presentation today, but thank you for your participation. Appreciate your input and continued data throughput. And I know we've asked for a lot of it, but just continue to encourage you guys to get that information to us, because it's going to be very vital and helpful to the overall system plan that will wrap up sometime early in calendar year 2022. So with that said, I am going to stop talking and turn it over to our consultant and project leader, Barb, with Woolpert and JAviation. And Barb, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, Grayson. I think I'm going to hide myself. But there's going to be a lot of information today. This is the first time we're sharing specifics on an airport by airport basis in terms of some of the recommendations that will be coming out of the plan. So if you do have questions, please stop me. I'll be happy to answer anything as we're going through this. Andrea assured me that the presentation will be posted sometime later this week, so you'll have a better opportunity to go through it at your leisure and see what we have found related to your individual airport. So with that, I don't know if I made myself go away or not. I think I did. Okay. So if you've been with us since we started the series of webinars, so far we've talked about the inventory, the forecast, the roles analysis for the airports, and the last time we had a webinar, it focused in on the system evaluation. How well are the airports currently performing in supporting the state's various economic and transportation needs? Today, we're going to talk about facility and service objectives, and those are projects in different categories that are needed to elevate the performance of the system. Once we have those projects or those actions identified, those form the core or the basis of our recommendations. We then do cost estimates for those, and then we've got our implementation of the study's recommendations and final reports. So we are getting near the end, and as Grayson said, we expect to be completed sometime right after the first of the year. Wrong way. Okay, so what exactly are facility and service objectives? As Grayson reminded all of you in a previous webinar, we talked about how the airports, using a wide variety of characteristics, both for the airports themselves and also for the communities they serve, were segregated into 4 different role categories. One is national business, one is regional business, one is general, and the last one is community. So as part of the system planning process, we developed facility and service objectives for airports that are assigned to each one of those 4 role categories. And the way that we established those objectives, we worked with the staff at OAC. We examined facility characteristics that you had for the airports that were identified in your last system plan, which was developed in 1999. We looked at some input and guidance as it's provided by the FAA. And then we also looked at other states that have similar objectives for their airports in place, so that we felt pretty comfortable that we were coming up with objectives for each role category that are steering you in the right direction and realistic for the kinds of airports to which the objectives are assigned. When we talk about the objectives, the facility and service objectives, they're graduated by airport. What that means is the larger the airport is, the more rigorous its objectives. So when you look at the objectives, you'll see that, like, for instance, for runway length, the national business airports, as might be expected, have the highest runway length objective, or the longest runway length objective down to the community airports, which have the lowest. So once we have all the objectives in place, then we conduct an analysis, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, to see if each airport is capable currently of meeting all of the objectives that apply to its particular role. And the information that we use in that analysis is data that we collected as part of the inventory effort. So we're going to have an opportunity here near the end of the study for everybody to refresh that information. But the data that you're going to see today is what your airport supplied as part of the inventory effort. So if you supplied data that was not current, or you didn't supply any data at all, and we had to make our best guess on what was going on, there may be some cleanup that we need to do on an individual airport basis. But we're going to cross that bridge a little bit down the road here. So the projects that we're going to talk about today are the airports that have what we're going to describe as deficiencies, are those where we identified that there is an objective, and from the data that we have access to, it appears that the airport is not currently meeting whatever its objective would be. Some of the things to think about when you're interpreting or looking at these facility and service objectives, these are considered in the system planning process to be the minimum level of development that's desirable for the airport based on its particular role in the state airport system. It's desirable, but not required. So these are not standards or regulations, so to speak, but they are they're guideposts to let each airport know where they should be headed in order for them to fulfill their role in state airport system. What should they have in place? Because the Oklahoma airport system is fairly mature in terms of the facilities and services that it has, many of the airports already exceed their objectives for certain needs, and that's fine. There's no reason why an airport can't exceed their objectives, and we find that they often do based on the individual needs of the airport. It's also possible that there'll be some airports that will not be able to fully achieve their objectives. That doesn't necessarily change the airport's role in the system. The roles that we assigned are based on a lot of different things, not just facilities. So let's just say, for instance, that an airport has an objective to have a runway length that's 5,000 feet. If there are environmental facility constraints to the airport, community constraints, whatever, if the airport can't achieve that runway length, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not still filling its role in the airport system. So that's something to remember. The projects that are identified through the facility and service objective analysis in the system plan should be reviewed when an airport does its individual master planning updates. These projects should point you in a direction that your airport should be headed so that it can meet its role in the state system for satisfying Oklahoma's needs for both transportation goals and its economic objectives. Anything that's identified for the most part in the system plan, especially projects that are airfield related, would still need to be justified through demand and confirmed through a master planning analysis. So in other words, if the system plan indicates that your airport needs a runway extension, you're not going to be able to go out and apply for funding from the FAA or from OAC just based alone on that recommendation. That'll have to be confirmed through an individual airport master plan. As Grayson mentioned, and we mentioned when we finished the roles analysis, we had 4 role categories: national business, regional business, general, and community. Once we started looking through those, the airports that were assigned to each of those 4 roles, we found that in particular in the general and the community role categories, we had a wide range of airports. We had some airports that were very busy, and toward the bottom of the spectrum, we had other airports that were not very busy at all. So to better fine tune the facility and service objectives within the general role category and the community role category, we further assigned the airports to either a high activity or a low activity characteristic. And based on whether an airport is general high or general low, there are some nuances in the facility and service objectives that we'll be talking about today, same for the community airports. Another thing that we did as part of the analysis was to examine the system to see if we have situations throughout the state where we have airports that might be providing overlapping facilities and services. Every year there are more requests than OAC can fulfill for projects that airports want to do. OAC wants to make sure that they're making wise investments. And one way to do that is to understand if in fact there are airports within the state system that might be providing overlapping facilities and services. And in order to look at that, we examined various areas of the state to see where we had overlaps in 30-mile service areas. Where we determined that there might be overlapping services, we have another category within the community role that's called maintain only. And in that particular category, those are airports that we identified that they, for whatever reason, are providing duplicative facilities and services with another airport in the system. So rather than invest to improve or expand those airports, the system plan has recommended that those airports be put in a maintain only category. Now that could change over time, especially if demand at those airports increases. But that's the role, the placeholder and the role that those airports were assigned to as part of this analysis. We also revisited NIPIA's National Plan of Integrated Airport System roles for the airports in the state. For those of you who may not know, an airport has to be included in the FAA NIPIAS document in order for them to be able to compete for federal funding. The minimum criteria, and there are many criteria, but one of the easiest to explain and consider is whether or not the airport has a minimum of 10 based aircraft. So looking at the airports in the state system, we do have some airports that we've identified for potential inclusion that are not in the NIPIAS now, as well as some airports that are currently in the NIPIAS that have fallen under that 10 based aircraft figure. So that'll be a discussion going forward between OAC and FAA, exactly how to fine tune the number of airports that are in the Oklahoma state airport system that are also included in the federal airport system as it's defined by the NIPIAS. So we're going to talk, and there's a lot of data today, and that's why I said I'm sure that'll be much easier to zero in on this once it's posted and you can go through it at your own pace. But we're going to talk about facility and service objectives in different categories. The first category that we're going to talk about is objectives that were established for the primary runway and taxiway systems at all of the study airports. And in that particular larger category, we looked at things like runway length, runway width, taxiway type, runway pavement condition, and then also runway strength. And if you look at this particular slide, you can see that the objectives are graduated by airport role. So if we look at the first line there with runway length, the national business airports have an objective for a 6,000 foot runway, regional business 5,000 feet, general 4,000 feet, and then community 3,200 feet. And this is the case in almost all of the facility and service objectives that we examined in the system plan. They are graduated. There are some exceptions to that. And if you jump down to the runway condition line, which is the fourth line down, you'll see that that objective is uniform for all airports, regardless of their role. to have a pavement condition index of 70 or greater on their primary runway, which indicates, generally speaking, that the pavement on the runway is in good shape. So there are, depending upon the role that you're in, the objectives are different in some cases, but applicable to the airports that are in your group or category in the system plan. So as you see, as we go through these slides today, and we're certainly not going to name everybody that needs a project in each one of these categories, but this is the first objective that we looked at, the runway length. And from this analysis, we determined that there are 30 airports in the system that could benefit from a runway extension in order to meet the objectives that were established in the system plan. If you'll remember, we said the runway length objective for the airports in the general rule category is 4,000 feet. And as you can see by the graph that we have here, the largest percentage, 47%, in terms of airports that need or could benefit from an extension of the airports fall into the general rule category. Again, these are objectives. They're not required. Many airports in the system exceed the objective for their role, and so obviously there's no action needed there. But for these airports that are shown on this particular slide, ideally, there could be a runway extension considered at these airports to meet the objective as it was established for their individual role in the state airport system plan. The next slide shows those airports that could benefit from a wider runway, primary runway, in order to meet the objectives. And as you can see here, for the most part, all of the airports, with this, save just a few, in the national business, regional business, and even in the community category, meet the objective that was established for the primary runway width. Again, the preponderance of airports, 21 out of the 26 that could benefit from a runway widening project are in the general rule category. The width that was recommended for the general airports was 75 feet. And there are many airports that are assigned to that general rule that fall below that width currently. The next objective was related to a taxiway system. And what the plan recommended was that all airports in the national business and regional business categories should have a full length parallel taxiway to serve their primary runway. You can see there are 6 airports between those two categories that currently don't have a full parallel. They have partial parallels. So ideally, those parallels should be extended to a full length of their primary runway. For the general airports, and if you remember back, we said we did a further segregation of the airports in that category to high activity and low activity. The high activity airports in the general rule category could benefit from a partial parallel taxiway for their primary runway and a turnaround on the other end, whereas the low activity general airports really only need turnarounds on both ends of their primary runway. So if you can see close enough on the slides, there's a little asterisk to the airports in the general rule category that need a partial parallel to meet the objective. There are 16 airports in the general rule category that need some kind of taxiway improvement, and it's kind of half and half. About half of them need a partial parallel and a turnaround to meet the objective, where the other half just need turnarounds to meet the objectives established in the plan. The next objective that we looked at was related to PCI, which is the Pavement Condition Index. And that was an objective. I think I pointed that out on an earlier slide, that this is uniform for all airports, regardless of their role in the system. And as you can see, all of the national business airports currently have a PCI of 70 or greater on their primary runway. There are a few airports in the regional business category that fell below that rating. But generally speaking, the system is in really pretty good shape in terms of the pavement condition index for primary runways around the state. This is one objective where we think there may have been projects that have been completed since the inventory data was assembled, and this that is supporting this analysis. So before we wrap the project up, we'll be revisiting this particular objective for sure to see if there are any updates that we need to make in terms of system performance for the pavement condition index. In addition to pavement condition index, we also set both single wheel and dual wheel pavement strength objectives by airport role. This particular slide shows the system's ability to meet the pavement or the single wheel weight bearing capacity only. It doesn't include the dual wheel objective. The reason for that is we were not able to secure dual wheel ratings for all of the system airports. We could get single wheel for everybody. So we started with that as the base for our analysis. All of the national business airports meet their objective for single wheel. And there are just a few airports in the regional business category that would need a strengthening project to meet their single wheel objective. So the majority of the airports that need any kind of additional pavement strength are in the general rule category and the community rule category. For the national business airports, we did have access to dual wheel strength information for all of the primary runways. The objective for the national business airports for dual wheel strength is 75,000 pounds. So we were able to do a separate analysis on the national business airports. And there are several of those that fall beneath that 75,000 pounds for a dual wheel rating currently. So there will be a runway strengthening project identified for those airports that we see here. And I think we've talked about this in previous calls that we had. As part of the study, we're developing a very comprehensive and interactive searchable database. It's built on a GIS platform that will be turning over to OAC here in the next couple months. And as they continue to monitor the system and look at how things change going forward, they will be collecting additional information on the dual wheel strength load bearing capacity for other airports around the state, so that we'll have a better picture of the system's ability to meet this particular objective going forward. The next category of facilities and services that we looked at relate to lighting, approach type, and various nav aids. When we get into looking at lighting, approaches, and nav aids, and you can see in the summary chart that we have here, when we get into the general airport role and the community airport role, you'll see some NAs there, not applicable. And that's because for that particular facility that we're looking at, it's not applicable to airports in those role categories. So in that case, there is no objective for, let's just say, an approach lighting system for airports that are in either the general or the community category. So sometimes in this batch of objectives that we looked at, it doesn't apply to either the general airports and or the community airports. But in this objective category, we looked at runway lighting. We looked at taxiway lighting as it relates to a partial or a full parallel taxiway. So this does not get into looking at all the different branches of taxiway systems that you might have at the airport, only looked at the full or partial parallel taxi system. We looked at the approach type. We looked at approach lighting. We looked at visual glide slope indicators. We looked at reels, and we looked at on-site weather reporting. When we look at runway lighting, almost every airport in the system already meets its objective for runway lighting, so that's a good thing. Oklahoma has obviously invested well, and the airports have, as part of their individual planning processes, made sure that they had adequate lighting on their primary runway. We also looked at taxiway lighting, and again, this relates only to the taxiway if it's full or partial parallel to the primary runway. There are a few airports in the regional business category that need improved taxiway lighting. In the general airport category, and if you can see the little asterisk there, some of those recommendations are being driven by the fact that these airports currently don't have a partial parallel, and a partial is recommended for those airports. So what happens there is that the partial parallel taxiway recommendation is also kicking in the recommendation for medium intensity taxiway lighting if those partial parallels are developed. And in the community category, since that it's not a recommendation to have either a full or a partial parallel taxiway, there is no associated taxiway lighting objectives for airports in that role. The next category relates to the approach to the primary runway. For regional business, we recommended that they should all have a precision-like approach, such as an LPV. It's our understanding that the FAA is probably not installing any more ILS systems, so a precision-like approach is considered adequate. For all the general airports, ideally, they should have at least a non-precision approach to one runway end. And in the community airport category, if the community airport is in that high activity category, we also recommended that there be a published approach of some sort to at least one runway end. So you can see the airports there that would need approach improvements if all the objectives are to be met. This is one category, as some of these nav aids are, that we're going to be getting into. Obviously, FAA has specific guidelines about thresholds that you have to meet for demand in certain types of operations to qualify to be considered for these various kinds of approaches. So obviously there are FAA guidelines that have to be fulfilled before the airports could hope to achieve or meet this particular objective. Another objective that we looked at for airports in the national business and regional business categories was having an approach lighting system. Ideally, for the national business airports, they should have an approach lighting system to both runway ends. The regional business airports, the objective, which is for one runway end. But you can see there, again, in order to meet that objective, there are a number of airports that would need to install approach lighting systems. Again, this is something that would be triggered once the airports meet certain demand thresholds as they're established by FAA, but something they should certainly consider and look at when they're updating their airport master plans or airport layout plans. Related to VGSI, the system plan looked at having PAPIs on both ends of the primary runway at the national business and regional business airports, one end for the general airports and one end for the high activity community airports. There were several airports that were identified that could benefit from having additional PAPIs installed to support their primary runway, assuming that they have sufficient demand to support that recommendation. One of the recommendations where we have the most airports in the state falling short of the objectives that were set in the system plan is related to runway end identifier lights. And there are 52 airports, almost half the system, that could benefit from additional runway end identifier lighting if they're to meet the objectives that were established in the system plan. This is not an objective for community airports in the community role. So these 52 airports fall into the national business, regional business, or general airport roles. Another objective in this category relates to having on-site weather reporting. This is an objective for just national airports, regional business, and high activity general airports. All of the national business airports already have on-site weather reporting. There's only one airport in the regional business role that we could identify that didn't currently have on-site weather reporting. So the majority of the airports that need on-site weather reporting to satisfy this objective fall into that general role category. We also looked at various landside facilities and airport support services. And in this overarching category, we looked at ramp size. And this is generally talking about the ramp that serves any kind of terminal area that the airport might have for general aviation, based aircraft and visiting aircraft. We looked at aircraft maintenance, the presence or the lack thereof. We looked at whether the airports had FBO services of any type. We looked at whether the airports had 100 low-lead fuel services. We looked at those that had Jet A fuel. And then we also looked at whether or not the airport had a general aviation terminal building. And that could be a building that is either associated with the airport owner or sponsor, or in some instances, it could be a building that belongs to a third party FBO. This is a kind of a unique category because while we have objectives for airports in various role categories, and let's just look at aircraft maintenance, for example, it's an objective or an ideal for the national business airports and regional business airports to have aircraft maintenance. But that's a service that's only going to be provided more or less if there's sufficient demand for somebody to make a living providing maintenance at those airports. The same kind of thing applies to fuel. If there's not sufficient demand in airport, it's not likely that they're going to be able to provide fuel and meet their objectives. So while we have objectives for some of these services, we recognize the fact that without sufficient demand, it's not likely for these objectives to be met. But nevertheless, it's a good yardstick to understand how well the system is performing. And in these particular categories, since we have this data recorded, OAC will be able to monitor these kinds of things going forward. And it helps them to understand if people are gaining maintenance services, if they're losing or gaining FBO services, that kind of thing for fuel, because changes in those kinds of services often signal that either an airport is growing or it's declining. So over time, as they continue to monitor whether an airport has services or not, the next time the system plan is updated, these will be good roadmaps to help understand if airports may need to have a role change going forward, either on an interim basis before the plan is fully updated again, or the next time a full update is completed. The ramp areas, and go back to the slide for a second, you can see that those are graduated based on the various role categories, are generally established considering that an airport has a certain mix of planes parked in the on the ramp area during the day, and gives also maneuvering areas for those planes to move around on the ramp. So through the objectives that were established, we identified that there were 37 different airports that could, possibly benefit from an expanded ramp. This again is really a facility that's probably best established during the master planning process, but this data will help our airports understand if this is something that they should be looking at when they do an airport update to their master plan or their airport layout plan. Another thing, and another facility that we identified need for improvement basically throughout the system and all the different role categories is for additional hangar storage. I don't know if any of you participated in a stakeholder survey that we had posted online for, I don't know, at least 6 months. But one of the comments that we got throughout that survey was that there are a lot of airports that don't appear to have adequate hangar storage. And as part of the system plan, we collected for OAC information on those airports that have waiting lists, more detailed information on the hangars themselves. And again, all of that will be compiled and available on that online data GIS database that we're working on. What is shown here, and this is a little bit different than some of the other facility and service objectives. The objective that was established by OAC related to hangar storage is that for the national business, the regional business, and the general airports, a hangar space should be available for every aircraft that's based at the airport. And then in addition to that, for the national business and regional business categories, they had some goals for having overnight storage for visiting aircraft also. So what we did with the inventory data that we had available was we came up with an estimated number of hangar spaces, not hangars themselves, but parking spaces in a hangar, whether it's a T hangar or a conventional hangar that are available at each airport. We looked at that number of estimated spaces, and then we compared that to the forecast of based aircraft for each airport that was developed as part of the system plan. So the result that you see here is not a current deficiency, it's a forecasted deficiency. So if airports don't expand their hangar storage, and they do grow in terms of based aircraft as they're projected to grow by the system plan, these are the shortfalls, or these airports we would expect to have some shortfall in terms of the number of hangar spaces they have available. The analysis that we have done to support all of these recommendations is bottom up. We look at each airport individually in its own facility and service objectives. And through that process, we create what we call an airport report card. So the airport report card takes everything that we think we know about the airport currently. It takes its objectives, and then it shows whatever deficiencies that we've been reviewing here this morning might be in place if in fact the current situation is reported accurately. Either yet this year or very early next year, we're going to be sharing those airport report cards with each airport so that they'll have an opportunity to look at more detailed recommendations for their airport before they get cast more or less in concrete as part of the system plan. So when you get your airport report card, you'll be able to see, for instance, I don't know, but Clinton Regional, pick an airport in the regional business category. You know, are you 2 hangar spaces short, or are you 20 hangar spaces short based on what the system plan has analyzed? So those individual airport recommendations for additional hangar storage will come to you via those airport report cards that each of you will be receiving so that you can check the recommendations for your individual airport. General aviation terminal buildings. In this particular slide, if the airport has an asterisk next to it, it means that based on the analysis, the inventory analysis that we were able to complete or that was provided by the individual airports, the airports currently have no building at all. And in the other instances, they need an expansion size-wise to their existing building in order to meet the objectives that were identified by the system plan. So there are a number of airports, especially in the general and the community rural categories, that appear to have no public terminal building currently. So that will require, assuming that there's demand and the willingness to do so, a new building to be constructed. Aircraft maintenance, ideally, the larger airports in the system in the national business and the regional business category should ideally offer some kind of maintenance service, both for visiting and based aircraft. Most of the national business and regional business airports do have this service, but there are a few that don't. Again, this is a service that or an objective that we recognize that without sufficient demand, a provider isn't going to show up and provide this kind of service. But ideally, these airports, if they have the business to support it, should be trying to find an operator to provide at least some kind of basic maintenance for visiting and based aircraft. 100 low-lead fuel. All the regional business and national business airports already have fuel available. There are just a few airports in the general category that don't report having low-lead fuel, and a few airports in the high activity community airports that don't. Having fuel is kind of a basic service. So if there is sufficient demand, it's most likely that the fuel at these airports would need to be provided by the airport owner or sponsor. It's probably not realistic to think that they would have a third-party FBO operating at the airport. This is the same kind of concept for JetFuel. There's only one national business airport that currently does not report having Jet A fuel services. All of the regional business airports have this service. And there are several airports in the high activity general category that could benefit, assuming that there's a willing provider from having Jet A fuel. So lots of stuff. I'm sure everybody's head's spinning. We can, answer any questions. We'll go through a few summary things here, but I think it's apparent when you look at the summary slides that we had that the majority of the improvements that are necessary to meet the objectives, the facility and service objectives, fall in the airports that are assigned to the general rule category. And what that is a reflection of is that Oklahoma has done a great job, for the most part, developing airports that are in the national and business regional business and national business world categories, that they're in pretty decent shape, and they need some additional improvements, but the majority of the deficiencies for the objectives fall to those airports that are in the general rule category. In terms of numbers of airports needing improvements, the runway end identifier lights and the additional hangar spaces have almost half of the system airports need some kind of an improvement if all of those objectives are to be met. And then we have not done all the cost estimating yet, but from looking at the information that we have available to us, it's apparent that the most costly improvements will be related to possible runway extensions that were identified for 30 airports, and then new or expanded general aviation terminal buildings that were identified for 32 airports. Some of that terminal building airport investment could be third party if in fact there's a sufficient level of demand at all of those airports or some of those airports for an FBO to construct a building. So what are we doing next? As you know, OAC has sent out a request to all of the airports for them to update what they call their NIPIAS list, which is FAA eligible projects. Those were actually due back to OAC on October the 15th. We're hoping that by November the 15th and no later than that all the airports will submit those lists. So our next step will be to compare those NIPIAS lists to the projects that are identified by the system plan and identify any kind of duplicative projects in either list so that we're not double counting the needs of any of the airports. After we have that comparison completed, we'll determine then what projects should be carried forward in the system plan in terms of a final recommendation, and we'll be developing cost estimates for those recommended plans for the recommended plan. We'll be using the data that we talked about today to set targets for future performance. it's important to, be going be going in some direction, and the analysis from this facility and service objectives will help OAC prioritize their investments, know where they're going to get the most return on the investments that they make, so that they can show that there is improvement in system performance being accomplished by the investment that's being made. So those are some of the concluding steps that we still will be working on. And again, those will be coming during the last 2 months of this year and early into next year. And we're hopeful that by about February and hopefully not much later than that, that we'll be able to share the final outcomes of the study. Prior to that, though, at some point you will be receiving these airport report cards that I mentioned, and it's really important to make sure that your airport is appropriately addressed in the plan to provide any updates that might be needed once you see what what is shown for your individual airport. We can answer any questions that you might have. If you do need to get in touch with anybody, Nick is with OAC is their project manager, and he can certainly answer. He's been working with us hand in hand. He knows almost as much about this as I think we do at this point, probably more than he ever hoped he would know. But if he can't answer it, he can direct you back to somebody at JVation, and we'll get you whatever information you might need. Grayson?
All right. Any questions from the group? Thank you, Barb, for that great presentation. All right. Barb, I have one just
Okay.
to start off with. When can the airports expect to get that individual report? Is that going to be after the first of the year, or is that going to be between Thanksgiving and Christmas? Kind of what's the anticipated time frame there?
What the anticipated time frame is, we need to get the full all the NIPIAS lists from all the airports so that we can do that comparison of system plan projects to NIPIAS projects. So I don't know. In talking with Nick, I'm hopeful that by the end of November, we'll have that full NIPIAS list vetted from you guys for all the airports. And I guess it'll depend upon how early in December we can get all of that cross-checking done. I don't want to send stuff out on December the 15th and expect that, everybody's going to have time to look at it, or it'll get lost. So if we can get everything cross-checked early in December, I would like to think that maybe that first week in December, we could distribute the report cards. And if we don't do it then, only because I don't want to, have those sitting in inboxes over the holidays, we'll probably wait and do it after the first of the year. But when we know, maybe you can do an email blast to everybody to let them know, when they should expect to see those. Okay. All right. Either be around the 1st of December or the first part of January, depending upon the NIPIAS list stuff being finalized. Okay. I appreciate that. Yeah. That was pretty much my only question. Go one more time for the group. Any airports on here want to ask anything of Barb or OAC?
Grayson,
seeing none, Nick, you have something you might want to add?
Yeah, just to kind of expound on what your question and what Barb was talking about. If obviously we're wanting to try to get all the costing information together before we send those report cards out so that you can get a full review of that. But anybody that wants to get a bit of a head start on that review, as Barb said, these slides will be posted here before too long, as we, we'll post a video as well as all these slides. And these slides indicate pretty much all the information aside from the costing analysis in terms of the evaluation that we've been done based off the objectives to this point. So if you see your airport's name under one of those items that you don't think it should be because you are no longer deficient because of a recent project or whatever the case may be, I won't say names. I saw at least 2 of those that I know, and I don't know that either of those airports are on the call right now, but there are at least 2 of those that we saw in the presentation today that I know need updates, because those deficiencies have been updated since this project began, and we got underway with those inventory efforts. So there are maybe more projects than you might think, and between the start of this project and to where we are right now, to where that information may no longer be quite 100% up to date. So that's one of the 2 things that we'll be evaluating internally, but also we'll be asking you to review those to make sure that we don't miss anything as well. So while we're still waiting on the costing analysis, we can certainly get a head start on the reviewing those other items that we talked about today, if you feel that it's not being represented appropriately right now.
If there was, if one of the objectives your airport showed up as being somebody that needed a project or some kind of action, and you think that's in error, it could be because we didn't have the correct inventory data, or it's changed since we collected. It's been, gosh, I don't know, coming up on a year, I guess, pretty quickly here since all that inventory data was assembled. I mean, we've been refreshing it, as we know, but there's, when you have 180 airports, it's a moving target. So if you do see anything related to your particular airport that you think looks like it's not correct, please do reach out to Nick and let him know, so we can get that updated. The sooner we start updating things, the more, the better it will be for all of us, and then it'll have a better shot at having everything current when we get to the end. Imagine we will have one final webinar. That for sure won't be till sometime after the first of the year. So, and just, I don't know, I know we talked about this in the very first webinar, but we have been working with Nick. Each airport will get its own individual report that summarizes what the system plan says about your airport. Those will probably be available sometime in February, early March kind of time frame. We're working on an executive summary, and then there'll also be like a 1-page fact sheet that's available on the system related to the system plan findings. So there will be products in addition to a huge technical report that come out of this that will help you talk about the system plan, and more importantly, understand what it means for your individual airport.
All right. Well, seeing no questions or hands raised, we'll conclude today's presentation. Thank you, Barb. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Grayson. Thank you, Nick.
And thank you for the airports that joined us and those that'll watch it here as a recorded session.
Excellent. Well, Barb, thank you so much. And for everybody else, obviously, if you have any questions about any of these items, please feel free to contact me, whether by phone, email, text, doesn't matter. I'm always happy to help in any way I can. And if you get confused about something or want to correct something, please reach out to me. I'll make sure we get JViation coordinated and we get everything updated the way it needs to be. So thank you, everybody, for participating. And we look forward to seeing you at our next and final webinar as we look to get toward the end of this project, so that we can take it to action once we get the full product. So we're certainly excited about what this means for OAC as well as the state system, and looking forward to the progress that we should be able to make as a result. So thank everybody for your participation, and hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, Nick. Bye.
Thanks.